The spark, how the world slid into war. The world in 1939 was teetering on a knife's edge, a fragile balance of power that could shatter with the slightest push. Europe's cities, still scared from the Great War, whispered tales of despair, poverty, and political unrest. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was simmering with anger, its people hungry for a revival of pride and power. In the shadows of this desperation rose a man whose vision was as dark as it was ambitious, Adolf Hitler. From the streets of Berlin to the halls of Versailles, the 1930s were a decade of uneasy calm, punctuated by growing aggression. Hitler's rise to power wasn't sudden. It was a fevered crescendo, fueled by economic collapse, nationalist fervor, and the sting of defeat. He spoke with a magnetic intensity, convincing a nation that their past humiliation could be undone, that Germany could rise again, and that the world would tremble before them. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime had already shown the world how force could reshape borders. His invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 had demonstrated the impotence of the League of Nations, exposing the weakness of collective diplomacy. And in Japan, militarists dreamed of an empire stretching across Asia, launching campaigns that would sow the seeds of global conflict. In Europe, nations watched, hesitant and divided. Britain and France, scared by the last war, clung to a fragile policy of appeasement, hoping that conceding to small demands could prevent another catastrophe. But Hitler's ambitions were relentless. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the demand for the Sudetenland were not just political maneuvers. They were harbingers of the storm to come. September 1, 1939, marked the point of no return. German tanks rolled into Poland, swift and brutal, executing the strategy that would become infamous as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The world had waited too long to respond. Britain and France declared war, and Europe was plunged into chaos once more. For the people on the streets of Warsaw, the air was filled with smoke, fear, and the unrelenting roar of engines and artillery. Families were torn apart, cities reduced to rubble, and a new era of warfare, mechanized, fast, and terrifying, had arrived. Across the Atlantic, America watched with a mix of horror and disbelief. The memories of World War I were still fresh in the minds of many, and the sentiment of isolationism ran deep. Yet, as Europe burned and dictators rose, it became increasingly clear that the conflict could not be contained. The sparks had ignited, and soon the fire would reach every corner of the globe. In the shadows of these monumental events, individual stories began to unfold. Farmers and factory workers, soldiers and spies, children and leaders, all caught in a tide they could neither control nor predict. History was no longer something recorded in books. It was something lived, breathed, and endured. And as the world slid toward war, every decision, every hesitation, every act of courage or cowardice would shake the fate of millions. The world had been warned, but few were prepared. The stage was set for the deadliest, most complex conflict humanity had ever known, a war that would redefine borders, ideologies, and the very essence of civilization. The Blitzkrieg storm, Europe falls. The dawn of 1940 brought with it a storm Europe had not seen since the cannons of the First World War fell silent. Germany, riding the momentum of its early victories, unleashed Blitzkrieg with terrifying precision. The name alone, Lightning War, belied the true horror. Tanks slicing through forests, planes streaking across the sky, and infantry advancing with relentless speed. Countries that thought themselves safe were suddenly engulfed in chaos, their defenses crumbling under an assault that was as psychological as it was physical. In Norway and Denmark, German forces struck swiftly. The fjords echoed with the thunder of artillery, and civilian populations watched helplessly as their homelands were occupied within days. Across Belgium and the Netherlands, families fled their homes, leaving everything behind. Streets once filled with laughter now carried the anguished cries of children, the sobs of mothers, and the panicked shouts of soldiers trying to hold the line. France, Europe's long-standing bastion of culture and military tradition, was caught in a whirlwind of shock and disbelief. The Maginot Line, a symbol of invincibility, proved tragically insufficient against the speed and cunning of blitzkrieg tactics. German forces bypassed fortifications, leaving towns and cities exposed. Paris, the city of light, felt the approaching shadow as tanks rolled closer, smoke rising in the distance like a dark omen. Britain, across the Channel, watched with growing alarm. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, newly at the helm, understood the gravity of the situation. The fall of France would not only threaten the continent, but the entire balance of power. Britain braced for the inevitable confrontation in the skies and on the shores, preparing its people for a war that would soon touch every household. Meanwhile, the human cost escalated. Soldiers fought with courage, but often found themselves outmatched by the mechanized efficiency of the German war machine. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with homes, schools, and hospitals reduced to rubble. Refugees flooded the roads, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. Yet even amidst the horror, acts of heroism emerged. Strangers sheltering the vulnerable, resistance fighters striking back in quiet defiance, and ordinary people risking everything to save lives. Across the Atlantic, America observed with a mix of horror and detachment. Newspapers chronicled the relentless advance of German forces, and radio broadcasts painted vivid pictures of cities under siege. Isolationist sentiment remained strong, yet the undeniable reality was that the war was spreading, and soon no nation could remain untouched. Factories ramped up production, and policymakers debated what role America might play, if any, in a conflict seemingly oceans away, yet with consequences that would inevitably ripple across the globe. By the summer of 1940, Europe was transformed. The Blitzkrieg had shattered not only armies, but also the illusion of safety. Nations were forced to confront a new reality. War was no longer a distant threat. It was the daily experience of millions. Streets once familiar were battlegrounds, skies once serene were theaters of destruction, and every decision, from the halls of power to the basements of ordinary homes, carried weighty consequences. In the shadow of this relentless storm, courage, desperation, and ingenuity became the currency of survival. Resistance movements sprouted like embers in occupied territories, daring to challenge a seemingly invincible force. And across oceans, a nation once hesitant to intervene began to understand that the tides of war were rising, and sooner or later, they would be swept up in the torrent. The Blitzkrieg storm had not only conquered lands, it had changed the very nature of warfare. Speed, coordination, and fear became weapons as lethal as guns and bombs. And as Europe fell, the world braced itself for the next chapter in a conflict that would redefine history, humanity, and the very essence of courage under fire. Pearl Harbor, America Awakes. December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sun rose over Pearl Harbor, glinting off calm waters, a serene sky stretching endlessly. Sailors cleaned decks, children played along the shoreline, and life followed its predictable rhythm. But beneath the surface of routine, an ominous tension brewed across the Pacific. Japan had been preparing in silence, a storm gathering that would soon shatter the American sense of security. Then, without warning, the sky erupted. Hundreds of Japanese planes streaked across the horizon, the roar of engines drowned only by the shriek of bombs tearing through air and steel. Battleships rocked violently as torpedoes slammed into their hulls, smoke and fire rising into the morning sky. Explosions echoed across the harbor, shattering windows, igniting fuel, and sending sailors scrambling for their lives. The world Americans had known, one of safety and distance from global conflict, vanished in an instant. In homes across the islands, families watched in horror. Mothers clutched children, fathers searched desperately for loved ones, and neighbors ran into the streets, unsure where to find shelter. The sounds of war were immediate, deafening, and terrifyingly close. The human cost was staggering. Nearly 2,400 Americans killed, over 1,000 wounded, and the Pacific Fleet crippled in a matter of hours. Yet amid the chaos, acts of courage and sacrifice shone through. Sailors manning guns even as fires consumed their ships, medics rushing into burning buildings to save lives, ordinary citizens stepping into extraordinary danger. Across the mainland, news of the attack reached New York, Chicago, and every corner of the United States. Shock turned quickly to outrage, grief to determination. For a nation that had hesitated to intervene in Europe, the attack on Pearl Harbor was undeniable. America could no longer remain on the sidelines. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, his voice steady but resolute, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The call to arms resounded through factories, farms, and classrooms, the American people united by a sense of purpose and a need to defend their homeland. From the docks of Hawaii to the streets of small-town America, the country mobilized. Young men enlisted, factories shifted to wartime production, and the once distant war suddenly felt intimately close. Soldiers trained with urgency, mechanics labored to repair damaged ships, and intelligence officers worked tirelessly to uncover the next threat. The Pacific was no longer a tranquil ocean. It had become the stage for a struggle that would demand every ounce of American ingenuity, courage, and resolve. Yet even as America awoke to war, the broader conflict continued. In Europe, blitzkrieg raged on. Britain endured nightly bombings, and resistance movements fought desperately in occupied territories. The world was now fully interconnected by violence, ideology, and survival. America's entry into the war marked a turning point. The balance of power would shift, battles would spread across oceans, and the very nature of global conflict would evolve. For those who lived through December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not merely a historical event. It was a lived experience of terror, courage, and sudden change. The calm of a Sunday morning gave way to the roar of war, and a nation was forever transformed. America had awoken, and the world would never be the same. The turning tide, D-Day, and resistance. June 6, 1944, a date that would be etched into history as the day courage, strategy, and sacrifice converged on the beaches of Normandy. Before dawn, the English Channel was a restless expanse of gray water, waves slapping against the hulls of thousands of landing crafts filled with soldiers. Men gripped rifles, helmets tight, hearts pounding. For many, this would be their first taste of the full, terrifying reality of war. Across the Atlantic, families in small-town America waited anxiously for news. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, clutched radios and newspapers, knowing that sons, husbands, and friends were part of an operation that would determine the fate of Europe and the outcome of the entire war. The stakes were incomprehensible, yet the hope was unwavering. Freedom would not be given. It would be fought for, one footstep, one bullet, one brave act at a time. On the beaches, chaos reigned. Machine gun fire tore through the air, sand exploded around landing crafts as shells found their marks, and smoke hung like a suffocating fog. Yet amidst the carnage, soldiers pressed forward, driven by training, camaraderie, and sheer willpower. Behind enemy lines, resistance fighters sabotaged communications, destroyed railways, and missiled German troops, creating the openings necessary for the Allied advance. Ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers risked their lives to hide soldiers, carry messages, and feed the hungry mouths of war. The bravery was staggering, but so too was the human cost. Thousands fell on those cold, blood-soaked beaches, young lives ending before they had truly begun. Yet every life lost became a testament to the fight for freedom, a spark that would ignite hope across a continent under oppression. For the Allied commanders, the landings were a calculated gamble, a high-risk maneuver requiring perfect coordination, intelligence, and luck. Every landing craft that reached the shore intact, every soldier who gained footing against impossible odds, was a step toward turning the tide of the war. Meanwhile, in London and Washington, leaders tracked every movement, their faces grim as reports arrived of victories, setbacks, and the relentless grind of battle. The war was no longer a distant theater. It was a global struggle, with the United States and Britain now fully committed to the liberation of Europe. The D-Day landings were the embodiment of that commitment, a declaration that tyranny would be confronted, oppression would be resisted, and the future of civilization was at stake. By nightfall, the beaches were secured, though at an immense cost. Soldiers regrouped, exhausted but undeterred. The resistance movements continued their relentless work, ensuring that the push inland would be possible. Europe had begun to turn, but the war was far from over. Cities still burned, supply lines were stretched thin, and the enemy remained formidable. Yet hope, the hard-earned, fragile hope of victory, was alive, flickering in the hearts of soldiers and civilians alike. The turning tide of D-Day demonstrated that courage, strategy, and unity could challenge even the most oppressive force. It was proof that human resilience, combined with careful planning and unwavering determination, could change the course of history. And as the Allies advanced across France, the world began to glimpse the possibility that darkness might finally give way to light. Part 5. The Atomic Dawn. Victory in Shadows. The summer of 1945 brought with it a tension that was both palpable and suffocating. In the Pacific, the war had dragged on with relentless intensity. Island after island, Japanese forces fought with desperation, each battle more brutal than the last. The American military advanced with calculated precision, but the cost in lives was staggering. Soldiers, exhausted yet unwavering, pressed on, knowing that the end of the conflict and the hope of returning home was within reach. Then came a weapon unlike any the world had seen. In a remote desert in New Mexico, scientists and military leaders convened under the code name the Manhattan Project, racing against time to harness the unimaginable power of the atom. When the bombs were finally ready, they represented both a promise and a peril, a swift end to the war, but a devastation that would forever haunt the human conscience. On August 6, 1945, the skies over Hiroshima were shattered by the first atomic bomb. In an instant, the city was engulfed in flames, lives were erased, and landscapes obliterated. Survivors wandered amidst the ruins, their eyes wide with disbelief, bodies scared by heat, radiation, and shock. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. The death toll was staggering, the scale of destruction unimaginable. Yet for America, the strategy was clear. The use of atomic power forced Japan's surrender and finally brought an end to a global conflict that had consumed millions. Across the United States, citizens grappled with the enormity of what had happened. Victory was celebrated, parades marched through city streets, and soldiers returned home to the embrace of family and friends. Yet beneath the jubilation lay a shadow, the realization that humanity had crossed a threshold, that the power to destroy entire cities now lay in human hands. The war was over, but the moral, political, and emotional reverberations would echo for decades. In Europe, celebrations were equally jubilant, but tempered by memory. Cities lay in ruins, millions had perished, and the continent faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Survivors told their stories, documenting acts of courage and horror alike. Resistance fighters returned home, bearing scars and memories that would never fade. Leaders convened to establish a fragile peace, forming the foundations of a new world order, determined to prevent such a catastrophe from occurring again. The atomic dawn marked both an ending and a beginning. The Allies had won, but the world had changed irrevocably. Borders were redrawn, alliances reshaped, and the shadow of nuclear power loomed over the geopolitical landscape. Humanity had glimpsed the depths of destruction, and the responsibility to wield such power wisely now rested on its shoulders. Yet amid the devastation and triumph, the human spirit endured. Stories of survival, compassion, and resilience persisted, reminding the world that even in the darkest hours, courage and hope could prevail. The war that had consumed nations and lives had also forged new alliances, innovations, and an awareness of the fragility of peace. It was a lesson seared into the conscience of the globe. Freedom must be defended, and the cost of ignorance and hatred is far too great to bear. As the sun set on 1945, the world looked forward with cautious optimism. The conflict that had reshaped continents, ideologies, and human lives had ended, but the echoes of its violence, courage, and consequences would linger forever. The atomic dawn had arrived, illuminating victory, but casting shadows that would define the next era of human history. Epilogue: the war that never truly ended. The guns of 1945 had fallen silent, but the echoes of the Second World War reverberated across continents, nations, and hearts. Europe lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, economies shattered, and millions of lives lost in a human tragedy of unprecedented scale. Yet amidst the devastation, a new world was being forged, a world determined to learn, to rebuild, and to ensure that the horrors of the past would not repeat themselves. The physical scars of the war were visible everywhere. Streets in London bore the marks of relentless bombing raids. Berlin, Warsaw, and Tokyo had neighborhoods obliterated. Factories and ports that once thrummed with life were reduced to skeletal remains. Refugees returned home cautiously, navigating destroyed infrastructure, and families mourned lost loved ones whose names were etched forever in memorials around the globe. The war had shown the fragility of civilization, the cost of unchecked ambition, and the profound value of human life. Politically, the map of the world was being rewritten. Europe, previously dominated by centuries-old empires, faced occupation, division, and reconstruction. The Allied powers, primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, emerged as superpowers, shaping global politics, trade, and security for decades to come. The United Nations was established in 1945, a bold effort to prevent another global conflict, to mediate disputes, and to promote human rights. Its very creation symbolized a collective recognition. Humanity must find a way to govern itself wisely, or suffer the consequences again. Yet the war's end did not erase conflict, it merely transformed it. The ideological battle between democracy and communism, which had simmered during the war, now erupted into the Cold War. The atomic bomb, which had ended Japan's resistance, cast a long shadow over international relations. The fear of nuclear annihilation, combined with geopolitical tension, created a world in which peace was fragile and vigilance essential. Lessons learned on the battlefield about diplomacy, strategy, and the human cost of war now informed the delicate balance of power between nations. Culturally and socially, the war reshaped societies. Women who had filled factories, offices, and farms during wartime began to demand continued recognition and rights. Technological advances, jet engines, radar, medical innovations, and computing accelerated as nations invested in rebuilding and innovation. The horrors of the Holocaust and other atrocities led to a renewed emphasis on human rights, ethical governance, and international law. Education became a tool for remembrance, ensuring that future generations would know the consequences of hatred, intolerance, and indifference. The human stories of courage, resilience, and survival became immortal. Ordinary people, soldiers, medics, resistance fighters, civilians hiding in occupied territories, emerged as testaments to endurance in the face of unimaginable adversity. Their letters, diaries, photographs, and testimonies now serve as living history, teaching us that even in the darkest times, hope, empathy, and courage can persist. Museums, memorials, and historical programs across the globe preserve these stories, ensuring that the lessons of the war remain vivid and instructive. For the United States, the war had been transformative. It shifted the nation from isolationism to international leadership, forged a sense of shared purpose, and accelerated technological and social change. American soldiers returned home to a country forever altered, carrying memories and experiences that shaped families, communities, and the very identity of a nation. The Marshall Plan, designed to rebuild Europe, demonstrated America's commitment to global stability and prosperity, illustrating that victory was not merely about defeating enemies but about nurturing peace. In education and scholarship, World War II remains a subject of profound study. Historians analyze strategy, diplomacy, and the complex interplay of political, economic, and cultural forces that led to war. Psychologists study trauma and resilience. Political scientists examine the origins of global governance structures. And students, teachers, and citizens alike reflect on moral questions. How do nations balance security with liberty? How can we prevent mass atrocities? How does humanity ensure that the horrors of one generation are not repeated in the next? Ultimately, the Second World War reminds us that history is both a warning and a guide. It teaches that freedom is fragile, peace is precious, and human life is invaluable. The war did not merely end in 1945. Its legacy continues to shape the world, influencing geopolitics, society, and culture to this day. While nations rebuilt, treaties were signed and borders redrawn, the memories, lessons, and shadows of the conflict endured, reminding humanity that vigilance, education, and compassion are the keys to ensuring that such darkness never rises again. As we close the story of the war that changed the world, it becomes clear. The Second World War was more than a military conflict. It was a crucible that tested humanity, revealing the depths of cruelty and the heights of courage, the destructive potential of ideology, and the enduring power of hope. The world emerged scared but enlightened, with a profound understanding that the cost of war is never merely measured in lives or territory. It is measured in the collective conscience of humanity. And so, the war that never truly ended continues to teach, warn, and inspire. Its lessons are etched not only in history books and memorials, but in the hearts and minds of every generation that seeks a world where freedom, dignity, and justice prevail. Subscribe to this channel now to enjoy all our new videos and share it with your friends. Stay well, stay healthy, and stay with us. Bye-bye.